Clara Whitmore set her husband's favorite supper on the table, smoothed her dress with both hands, and waited. The clock on the mantel struck 7, then 8, then 9. He never came. Not that night. Not for their anniversary. And when she finally heard his boots on the porch after midnight, she smelled the lavender water of another woman on his coat before he even opened the door. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply blew out the candle she had been saving for the celebration and sat alone in the dark. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Virginia had never seen a summer so merciless. The heat pressed down on Carter Manor like a hand flat against the earth, forcing everything low and still. The fields stretched long and golden under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Horses moved slow in the paddocks. The house servants fanned themselves in the shade of the back porch, speaking in low voices about the drought that was coming, about the creek that had already dropped 2 feet since June, about the old Thomas Bell, who said he could feel it in his knees. Rain wasn't coming for a long while yet. But inside Carter Manor, the heat that mattered most had nothing to do with the sun. Clara Whitmore. Carter stood at the window of the upstairs sitting room and watched her husband ride away from the house for the 3rd morning in a row without once looking up. She watched until he disappeared past the far tree line. Then she turned back to the room and picked up the embroidery she had set down the night before and had not touched since. She did not throw it. She did not weep. She pressed the cloth flat against her knee and pulled the needle through with the same steady hand she used for everything in this house. The household accounts, the weekly menus, the letters to tenants, the arrangements for every dinner and every gathering. Nathaniel Carter had hosted in 5 years of marriage. Steady, always steady. That was what people said about Clara. That Mrs. Carter, the women of Richmond would say at their sewing circles, tilting their heads with that particular kind of sympathy that was almost admiration and not quite pity. She is the steadiest woman I have ever known. What they meant, and what they never said plainly, was this: they did not know how she bore it. She had been 19 years old when her father called her into his study and told her that Nathaniel Carter had come to ask for her hand. Her father, James Whitmore, was a decent man who ran a modest trading business out of Richmond. He was not poor, but he was not the kind of man who sat at the same tables as the Carters. Nobody in their circle was. The Carter family had owned more land in Virginia than some men owned in their whole counties. Nathaniel's grandfather had built the original manor house. His father had doubled it. And Nathaniel himself, at 32, had consolidated every piece of it into an operation that made other plantation owners speak carefully when they talked about money. He came himself, her father said, and Clara could hear the wonder in his voice, even through his effort to sound measured. Came himself, sat in that chair where you're sitting, and made a very proper offer. Clara had looked at the chair. Did he say why? She asked. Her father cleared his throat. He said you were sensible, that he had watched you manage the Hargrove charity auction last spring, and he was impressed with your composure. Composure. That was the word Nathaniel Carter had used to describe her. Not beautiful, not charming, not warm. Composed. She was 19 years old, and she told her father yes, because what 19-year-old girl in Virginia in the year 1816 said no to Nathaniel Carter? And because she believed the way girls that age believe things that are more hope than fact, that composure was simply what a man said before he learned the rest of you. She believed he would learn the rest of her. She spent 5 years waiting for that to happen. Their wedding had been the largest event Richmond society had seen in a decade. Clara remembered standing in the church vestibule in a white dress that had taken her mother and 2 seamstresses 4 months to finish, and feeling for just one moment like the kind of woman stories were told about. The doors opened. The music started. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and when she reached the altar and looked up at Nathaniel, he was looking somewhere above her head. Not at her. Past her. Checking, she realized later that the groomsmen were standing in the right positions. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She told herself a great many things in those first years. She learned his preferences the way a student learns a difficult subject carefully, systematically, with real effort. She learned that he took his coffee black and his eggs soft, and that he could not stand the smell of lavender inside the house, though he never said so directly, only pressed his lips together slightly when she wore it. She switched to rosewater. She learned that he preferred silence at breakfast and conversation at supper, but only on certain topics, business, land, local politics. Not feelings, never feelings. She learned to bring things up sideways through questions about the farm or the community, and sometimes he would talk to her for 20 minutes that way, and she would go to bed feeling almost close to him, too. She managed his household with the kind of precision that his mother, God rest her, apparently never had. The accounts balanced. The staff was loyal and well treated. The food was always what it should be. The house was never embarrassing. When important men came to Carter Manor for dinners, their wives complimented Clara on the arrangements, and their husbands complimented Nathaniel on his household. And Nathaniel would nod and say, "My wife manages things," and she told herself that was a kind of acknowledgement. She visited the sick workers on their land every week, driving herself in the small cart, bringing medicine and food. She wrote letters for families who couldn't write their own. She organized a lending library out of the spare books in Carter Manor's study. Nathaniel had never read half of them, and opened it to anyone in the county who wanted access. She did everything she could think of to fill the space between them with something that mattered. And he moved through the house around her, the way water moves around a stone in a river, acknowledging her presence only in the way that he adjusted his course slightly so as not to run directly into her. Mrs. Carter. Margaret Ellis appeared in the doorway of the sitting room with the quiet efficiency that had marked her 40 years of service in this house, first to Nathaniel's parents and now to them. She was a broad, plain-faced woman of 50, with iron gray hair and eyes that saw everything and commented on very little. "The Haverford party this evening," she said. "Will you be attending?" Clara set down the embroidery. "Has Mr. Carter indicated his plans?" Mr. Carter left word with Robert that he would be arriving directly from the Whitfield property. He expects you to meet him there. Clara stood and moved to the small mirror above the fireplace to check her hair. "Then I will meet him there." Margaret was quiet for a moment longer than a simple errand required. Clara caught her eye in the mirror. "Margaret." "Ma'am?" "Whatever it is you're deciding whether to say, you may say it." The older woman folded her hands in front of her apron. "Miss Caroline Hayes will be at the Haverford gathering this evening. I thought you ought to know." The name settled into the room like a stone into still water. Clara held the older woman's gaze in the mirror for a count of 3. Then she turned back to her own reflection and adjusted a pin in her hair with a hand that did not waver. "Thank you, Margaret," she said. So, Miss Caroline Hayes, 23 years old, the daughter of a prosperous Charlottesville merchant, dark-haired with that particular kind of pretty that looked effortless even when it wasn't. She had arrived in their social circle 8 months ago when her family purchased the old Mercer property, and she had moved through Virginia society with the easy confidence of a woman who had never once doubted that rooms would make space for her. Clara had no proof of anything. She wanted to be precise about that, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. She was not a woman who made accusations without evidence, but she was also not a woman who was blind. She had watched Nathaniel for 5 years. She knew every inflection of his voice, every variation of his expression. She knew when he was bored, and when he was engaged, and when he was performing politeness out of obligation. She knew the difference, and she knew that when Nathaniel Carter was near Caroline Hayes, something in him that was usually closed became almost imperceptibly open. The Haverford house sat on a rise above a wide lawn that stayed green even in the worst summers because of a spring that ran underneath it. By the time Clara arrived in the Carter carriage, the party was already well underway. Torches lined the path from the gate. The music drifted out through the open windows, something bright and quick, the kind of thing you could hear and feel at once. She stepped down without waiting for the footman's assistance, smoothed her skirts and walked in. She found Nathaniel within 2 minutes. He was standing near the far end of the main room with a group of men she recognized, James Haverford himself, and two of the Whitfield cousins, and a man from Petersburg she didn't know. Nathaniel was taller than all of them, and in the candlelight he looked exactly like what he was, the most significant man in the room, easy in his authority, perfectly comfortable at the center of things. She crossed toward him. He saw her. She was certain of that. His eyes moved across her face, with the brief, efficient recognition of a man checking an item off a list. Then he turned back to the Whitfield cousin he had been speaking to and picked up the sentence he had paused. Clara stopped beside him. "Good evening, Nathaniel," she said. "Clara." He did not look at her again. "Glad you made it." James Haverford was gentlemanly enough to turn to her with warmth he didn't have to manufacture. "Mrs. Carter, you look lovely this evening. Martha will be so pleased you're here." "I wouldn't have missed it," Clara said, and made herself smile. She lasted 40 minutes in polite conversation before she saw them together. She was standing near the doorway to the side parlor, talking with Martha Haverford about the lending library. Martha wanted to know if she might donate some volumes when she saw Nathaniel across the room. He was standing with Carolyn Hayes. That alone was not remarkable. What was remarkable, what made the air in Clara's lungs go briefly terribly thin, was the way he was standing. He had turned his body toward her. Completely toward her, the way he almost never turned his body toward Clara, with his full attention, and both shoulders, and his eyes, that were even from across a crowded room, unmistakably warm. Caroline said something. Nathaniel laughed. An actual laugh, low and real, the kind Clara had heard from him perhaps a dozen times in 5 years. His hand rested on Caroline's arm. Just for a moment. Just briefly. But Clara saw it. And so did half the room. Martha Haverford kept talking. Clara kept nodding. She heard approximately none of it. She excused herself carefully, with a smile that she wore the way you wear a coat in a downpour. It keeps the worst of it off you, but you feel the cold all the same. And she found a quiet corner near an open window where the night air moved in off the lawn. She stood there and breathed. She had known. She had known for months, in the way you know something you are not yet ready to name. And she had told herself that knowing and proving were different things, and that a woman who valued her dignity did not throw accusations at shadows. But there was a difference between a shadow and a thing standing right in front of you in the candlelight. Around her, she could feel the shift in the room, the polite glances that cut sideways toward her and then away. The women who found reasons to move closer to their husbands. The low murmur of conversation that had the particular rhythm of people discussing someone who was present. She had become a story people were watching unfold in real time. "Mrs. Carter." The voice was quiet and came from her left. She turned. Samuel Reed stood a few feet away holding 2 glasses of lemonade with the slightly uncertain expression of a man who had made a decision and was not entirely sure it was the right one. He was 35, the owner of Reed's Books and Goods, on the main street in Clover Hill, the small town nearest to Carter Manor. Clara had been one of his best customers for 3 years, and had become somewhere along the way something that occupied a comfortable place between acquaintance and friend. He was a quiet, precise man, who read everything and said only what he meant, which Clara had always found restful. "Samuel," she said, "I thought you might want something cold," he said, offering one of the glasses. "And company that isn't currently talking about you." She took the glass. "Is that what they're doing?" "Some of them." He said it plainly without apology because he knew she would prefer that. "Not all." She drank the lemonade. It was cold and tart, and exactly what she needed. "Thank you," she said. They stood together in the quiet by the window, not speaking, watching the room, and Clara felt the tightness in her chest ease fractionally. Not because anything had changed, but because there was something almost unbearable about being looked at by a room full of people, and something almost bearable about standing next to a person who was simply there without wanting anything from you. She left before the supper hour. She did not say goodbye to Nathaniel. She found Martha Haverford and thanked her warmly, and made her excuses a mild headache. Nothing concerning, and walked out to the waiting carriage. The ride home was quiet. The driver knew better than to make conversation. The night was warm and thick, and full of the sound of insects in the dark fields on either side of the road. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and thought very clearly which was something she did better alone. She had spent 5 years being useful. 5 years being steady. 5 years building a life inside a house where the man who owned it moved past her like she was furniture he had stopped noticing. She had told herself it was enough. She had told herself she was content. She had told herself that not all marriages were built on warmth and that a woman of sense knew the difference between what she wanted and what was real. But there was a point at which the thing you were telling yourself stopped being wisdom and started being the story you told because the truth was too heavy to carry all at once. She had reached that point tonight. The carriage turned through the gates of Carter Manor. The house was dark except for the lamps Margaret always left burning in the front hall. Clara stepped out and walked up the porch steps and opened the front door. Inside the house was quiet. The clock in the front hall ticked its steady, indifferent tick. The table in the entryway held the mail. She had already sorted the list of the week's accounts. She had already settled the calendar she had already marked with the week's engagements. She picked up the mail out of habit, then set it back down. She looked at the house around her, the clean floors, the carefully tended rooms, the evidence of 5 years of her attention and effort in every corner. And for the first time, instead of feeling the satisfaction of having done the work well, she felt something else entirely. She felt the weight of it. Upstairs, she sat at the small writing desk in the corner of her room and opened the leather journal she had kept since she was 16 years old, one of the few things in this house that was entirely and only hers. She did not write about Nathaniel. She had made that decision years ago. She would not fill pages with a man who didn't fill them with her. She wrote about Thomas Bell instead. Old Thomas Bell, 60 years old, who farmed the piece of land just east of Carter property and who had lost a quarter of his crop already to the dry summer. She had brought his family a basket of preserves and salt pork last week, and his wife Mary had cried, which Clara suspected had less to do with the food and more to do with the fact that someone had come. She wrote about the children she had been teaching to read on Tuesday afternoons, 8 of them, now ranging from 6 to 11 years old, crowded into the Bells' front room with borrowed primers and an enormous amount of noise. She wrote about what it felt like to watch a child sound out a word for the first time. She wrote until the candle burned low. Then she closed the journal and sat for a long time in the quiet, and she thought about something her mother had told her once when she was very young, that the bravest thing a person could do was to want something specific out of their life, and to say so plainly, even if what they wanted was not what they had. Clara had spent 5 years not saying it plainly, even to herself. She picked up her pen. She opened the journal again, and she wrote one sentence. "I am worth more than being a woman who waits." She closed it, blew out the candle, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she slept without listening for the sound of boots on the porch. The next morning, Nathaniel came down to breakfast before she did. That in itself was unusual. Clara was almost always at the table. First coffee poured, the morning's correspondence laid out. She had not intended to sleep so late. She came down the stairs to find him already seated, already eating, already looking at a letter that must have arrived early. He glanced up. "You slept late," he said. "I did," she agreed, and went to the sideboard and poured her own coffee. She sat down across from him. He returned to the letter. "I'll be going to the Whitfield property again today," he said without looking up. "I won't be back for supper." "All right," she said. A pause. The Haverford gathering was pleasant, he said, still not looking up. The words had the quality of something he had decided he should say. "Yes," Clara said. "You left early." "I had a headache." He looked up then briefly, with that quick, efficient glance that checked facts without asking questions. She held his gaze evenly over the rim of her coffee cup. Whatever he saw in her face or didn't see, he returned to his letter. "I'll give your regards to the Whitfields," he said. "Please," she said. He finished his breakfast. He folded the letter. He pushed back from the table and picked up his hat from the hook by the door and put it on. He paused at the door. For a moment, just a moment, he looked at her sitting at the long table in the morning light, with her coffee and her steady hands, and her face that did not ask him to stay. "Clara," he said. "Yes." A beat. 2. "Have a good day," he said. He walked out. Clara sat very still and listened to the sound of his horse moving away from the house. Then she set down her coffee cup, picked up the small notebook she kept for household accounts, and wrote at the top of a new page, Tuesday, June 14th, "Things to do." She underlined it. And she began a list that had nothing at all to do with Nathaniel Carter. The list Clara wrote that Tuesday morning was not dramatic. It did not say, "Leave him." It did not say, "Fight back." It did not say anything that would have made for a good story told quickly over a fence between neighbors. It said, "Visit Thomas Bell. Bring flour and salt pork. Ask Mary about the children's progress with the primers. Stop at Reed's books. Order 2 more readers if Samuel has them. Write to Mrs. Portman in Richmond about the Charitable Society meeting in August." Small things, ordinary things. The kind of things Clara had been doing quietly for years in the margins of a life that was mostly organized around someone else. The difference was that this time she didn't tell anyone she was going. She didn't leave a note on the hall table. She didn't arrange for someone to tell Nathaniel where she'd be in case he asked, which he never did. But she had always made the provision anyway, out of habit or hopefulness, or some stubborn insistence on the possibility that one day he might want to know. She just went. She harnessed the small cart herself, because the stable hand was occupied with the horses Nathaniel had taken, and she drove out past the east fields and down the narrow road toward the Bell property. And the morning was already hot, and the fields on either side were dry, in a way that made the air taste faintly of dust, and she felt for no reason she could fully articulate lighter than she had in months. Thomas Bell was in his yard when she arrived, trying to mend a section of fence with the particular frustrated efficiency of a man who knew the work was outpacing his hands. He was 60 years old, and he moved like a man of 60, who had worked every one of those years with his body slow in the joints, but stubborn in the will. He looked up when she drove in. His face did something complicated, surprise and relief, and a kind of dignity that didn't want to appear too much in need. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Mr. Bell." She climbed down from the cart without waiting for assistance. "That fence section's been going since March, hasn't it?" He looked at it. "End of February, ma'am, if we're being precise." "Let me help you with it." He opened his mouth. "I'm not asking," she said, and picked up the second length of rope from the ground. They worked on the fence together for the better part of an hour, and somewhere in that hour, between the pulling of rope and the hammering of stakes, Thomas Bell stopped being a proud man accepting charity, and became a person having a conversation with another person. And he told her about the dry spell, about the creek dropping, about the section of corn he'd lost already, and the section he thought he might still save if the weather shifted. And Clara listened the way she had always listened, completely, without interrupting, without making it about herself. "The Carter land's not faring much better," she said when he mentioned the creek. "No, ma'am." He paused. "Begging your pardon, but is Mr. Carter thinking of opening the South Reservoir? My neighbor Hayes says his land is upstream from it. If the reservoir opened even partial, it'd help 3 or 4 farms down our way." Clara looked at the fence post in her hand. "I'll ask him," she said. She would. She already knew what he would say. Some version of, "I'll look into it," which meant it would sit in a pile of things he intended to look into, but she would ask. Because Thomas Bell deserved someone to ask. "You're a good woman, Mrs. Carter," Thomas said. Not sycophantically, just plainly the way old men state facts they've observed long enough to be sure of. Clara pulled the rope taut. "I'm just a neighbor," she said. Mary Bell was in the house with the children, and when Clara came in with the flour and the salt pork and a small jar of blackberry preserves she'd put up herself, Mary pressed her lips together hard and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was what she did instead of crying, and then said briskly, "Well, sit down then, and I'll put on water." The children came in from the back room, in a wave 7 of them, ranging from the 6-year-old girl named Hattie, who had only recently begun speaking in full sentences, to the 11-year-old boy, James Jr., who read faster than Clara could keep him supplied with material. "Mrs. Carter." Hattie latched onto Clara's arm without ceremony. "I read the whole primer, the whole one, even the last page with the long words." "Did you?" Clara sat down and turned to face her properly. "Show me." Hattie ran and came back with the battered primer and sat right next to Clara and read the last page aloud slowly, with effort mispronouncing government in a way that made the older children snicker, until Mary silenced them with a look, and Clara listened to every word, and when Hattie finished, Clara said, "Hattie Bell, that is one of the finest things I have heard this summer." Hattie beamed with her whole body the way only 6-year-olds can. James Jr. leaned against the doorframe, with the careful nonchalance of an 11-year-old, trying not to look interested. "I finished the history volume," he said. Clara looked up at him. "All of it. All of it." A pause. "It was good." "Which part?" He considered. "The part about the men at Philadelphia. How they argued for months and months and couldn't agree on anything, and then they did." Another pause. "I didn't know it was that hard." "Most good things are," Clara said. He nodded slowly, like a person filing information away. She stayed for 2 hours. She drank Mary's tea and talked with Thomas on the porch about the reservoir and the summer and the state of things, and before she left, she made a decision. She had been considering for 3 weeks she would run the Tuesday readings here at the Bell Farm properly. Not just a loosely organized lending situation, but a real session with structure, with a progression of texts, with enough copies for every child who wanted to come. She would bring primers and reading books from the Carter Library, the ones Nathaniel had never opened, and she would do it every week, rain or shine, whether anyone else approved or not. She told Mary. Mary looked at her for a long moment. "Clara Whitmore," she said, using her maiden name the way women sometimes did, when they meant to say something true about who a person really was. "You are wasting yourself in that house." Clara stood up and smoothed her skirts. "Not anymore," she said. She stopped at Reed's Books on the way back. The store was cool and dim inside, the way bookstores always managed to be even in the worst summers, and it smelled the way Clara had loved since childhood, paper and ink and something faintly like cedar from the shelves Samuel had built himself. A small bell rang when she pushed open the door. Samuel was behind the counter marking a ledger, and he looked up with the unhurried expression of a man who was always glad when she came in and never made a performance of it. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I wasn't expecting you till Friday. I need readers. 4 of them if you have them, simple ones for young children." He set down his pen. "I have 3. I can order a 4th from Richmond, have it by the end of next week." "Order 2, she said. "And a history volume for an 11-year-old who reads faster than I can supply him." Samuel wrote it in his ledger. "The Bell children. And whoever else comes." She moved along the shelf nearest the counter reading spines. "I'm starting proper Tuesday sessions. At the Bell Farm." A beat. "That's a fine idea," Samuel said. "People will say it isn't my place." "Some people," he agreed. She pulled a slim volume from the shelf and turned it in her hands. "I find I care considerably less about that than I used to." Samuel looked at her. Not the way some men looked at her, assessing or pitying or calculating the distance between her and Nathaniel and what it might mean, but the way a person looked at another person they respected enough to be honest with. "Something's changed," he said. It was not quite a question. Clara set the book back on the shelf and looked at him directly. "I've been waiting for 5 years for someone to notice what I'm doing," she said. "I've decided to stop waiting." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Carter, I've noticed." She picked up her gloves from the counter. "Order the readers, Samuel, and the history volume." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She walked out. But halfway down the street, she stopped. She turned around, walked back in, pushed open the door and said, "Thank you. For last night. You didn't have to do that." Samuel looked up from his ledger. "Yes, I did," he said simply. She nodded once and left for good that time. Margaret was waiting on the front porch of Carter Manor when Clara drove back through the gates. This was not unusual. Margaret often found reasons to be near the front of the house when she expected Clara back from somewhere, and Clara had long ago understood that this was the housekeeper's version of caring practical present, never stated directly. "Mr. Carter sent word," Margaret said, taking the horse's bridle while Clara climbed down. "He'll be home for supper after all. I'll let Cook know." "I already told her." Margaret paused. "He's bringing a guest." Clara looked up. "Mr. Whitfield," Margaret said. "The younger one. They want to discuss something about the property line on the south side." "All right," Clara said. "I can set the good dining room." "Yes, please." She was already moving toward the door. "And Margaret, the lending books in the study on the third shelf, the old primers, can you have someone bring them down to the front hall? I need them for Tuesday." Margaret stopped. "The Carter primers. They're not being used." Clara paused in the doorway and looked back. "They haven't been used in 20 years. I checked the dust." Margaret looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind her steady eyes. Something that might have been satisfaction, if satisfaction were the sort of thing Margaret Ellis allowed herself to show. "I'll have them brought down," she said. Supper with Nathaniel and the younger Whitfield was exactly what Clara expected it to be. Cornelius Whitfield was 30, pleasant-featured, and talked about land with the focused enthusiasm of a man who had recently inherited property and was still intoxicated by the fact of it. Nathaniel was attentive and knowledgeable and steered the conversation expertly in the way he always did, when business required charm rather than authority. Clara sat at her end of the table and managed the meal and asked the right questions at the right moments and made sure the wine was replenished and the food came out when it should. And every now and then, Cornelius Whitfield looked at her with genuine warmth and said something like, "You run a remarkable household, Mrs. Carter." And she thanked him because it was true and because he meant it kindly. Nathaniel did not look at her with warmth, but neither was he unkind. He was just himself, present contained efficient, filling the role of host with the professionalism of someone who had been doing it all his life. After supper, when Cornelius Whitfield had gone and the house had settled into its night quiet, Nathaniel poured himself a glass of brandy in the front parlor and Clara came in to say good night. He looked up. "The Whitfield boy speaks highly of you," he said. Clara stopped. "That's kind of him." "He said his housekeeper told his mother that the Bell children have learned to read, that you've been going there." She looked at him steadily. "Every Tuesday, for almost a year." Something crossed his face. She couldn't name it precisely. Not guilt exactly. Not quite surprise. Something in between. "I didn't know it had been that regular," he said. "You didn't ask," she said. Not sharp, not accusing. Just a fact stated the way Thomas Bell stated facts plainly, because they had been observed long enough to be certain. Nathaniel looked at his glass. "I'm told you're planning to expand it," he said. "Starting next Tuesday. Proper sessions. I've pulled the primers from the study." A pause. "Those are old." "They're still readable." Another pause. "I could have new ones ordered from Richmond." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the glass in his hand with the expression of a man who was performing a kind of generosity he hadn't entirely figured out how to do naturally. She waited to feel something warm about it. She didn't. Not quite. "Samuel Reed is already ordering from Richmond," she said. "But thank you." She said good night and went upstairs. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the expression on Nathaniel's face when he said, "I didn't know it had been that regular." The mild surprise of it. The way he had said it, like a man who had just noticed a piece of furniture he passed every day, had been moved slightly, registering the change without having any real accounting of where the thing had been before. She was not angry. She was something quieter and more serious than anger. She was finished with invisibility. The Tuesdays became the structure of her weeks in a way nothing had before. She drove to the Bell farm every Tuesday morning with primers and paper and a box of pencils she purchased with her own household allowance, the portion of it she had always quietly saved without knowing exactly why. She arrived at 8, and by 1:30 there were children crowded into the Bell front room ranging in age from 6 to 12, and she had arranged them by reading level rather than age, which had caused some initial protest from the 11-year-olds, who felt insulted at being placed next to 7-year-olds until she explained that reading was not about years lived, but about practice invested, and after that, the 11-year-olds concentrated very hard. She taught the way she had taught herself, not drilling, but talking, asking questions, letting the children argue about what words meant, letting James Jr. correct her, once on a point of historical fact. She had gotten wrong, which he did with enormous satisfaction, and which she acknowledged fully, because being wrong gracefully was one of the things she had decided she could model as well as reading. Word spread, the way word spread in small Virginia communities sideways through women talking in markets and at wells and over garden fences. By the third Tuesday, there were 15 children instead of 8. By the 5th, 3 mothers had begun coming too, sitting in the back with their own borrowed primers and learning alongside their children with a self-consciousness that gradually over weeks became something else. Concentration, then pleasure, then the particular pride of a person discovering they are not as limited as they had been led to believe. Martha Haverford came on a Wednesday afternoon specifically to ask Clara if she would consider expanding the sessions to include adult women from some of the surrounding farms. Clara said yes before Martha had finished the sentence. And something happened that Clara had not entirely anticipated. She stopped feeling like a woman waiting. Not because things with Nathaniel had changed. They hadn't, not in any fundamental way. He was still courteous and still distant. He still moved through the house around her like she was a feature of it, rather than the person who had built its character. She still slept on her side of the bed, and he on his, and the space between them was the same measured silence it had always been. But she stopped needing that to be different in order to feel like her own life was real. And that shift, that small interior revolution, changed everything about how she moved through the world. It was on the 4th Tuesday of July that the first real whisper reached her. She was in the Bell front room with 8 children and 3 women, when Hattie's older sister, a girl of 9 named Ruth, who rarely spoke, said suddenly during a break between reading sessions, "My mama says Miss Hayes is going to come to Virginia to stay permanent." The room got very quiet. Clara kept her face completely still. "Does she?" she said. Ruth nodded importantly. "They say her daddy bought the Mercer property outright, not just renting anymore, and Mama says that means Miss Hayes will be a neighbor now proper-like." Clara looked at the primer in her hands. "Well," she said, "let's see where we left off. James Jr., you were on page 43. James Jr., who was 12 years old and understood quite a lot more than adults usually gave him credit for, looked at Clara with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and respect and opened his book to page 43 without saying a single word about anything else. She drove home that afternoon with the information sitting in her chest like a stone. Not because it changed anything. She told herself that clearly, precisely, it doesn't change anything. What she had felt at the Haverford gathering, the clarity she had found in that terrible quiet moment by the window, had not been about Carolyn Hayes. It had been about herself. About 5 years and a candle, and the length of time a person could spend waiting in the dark. But she was also honest enough to admit that the information was not nothing. She drove through the Carter gates and handed the horse to the stable hand and walked into the house, and Margaret was in the front hall, and one look at Clara's face made Margaret say, "I'll have your tea brought to the sitting room." "Thank you," Clara said. "Miss Hayes's family has purchased the Mercer property." "I know," Clara said. "Word came this morning." "I know Margaret." The housekeeper looked at her with those steady gray eyes that had seen 50 years of this family's interior weather and kept their own counsel about it. "Clara," she said, and it was so unusual for Margaret to use her given name that Clara stopped moving entirely. Margaret pressed her lips together once the way she did when she was going to say something she had decided to say and not take back. "That man," she said quietly, "does not know what he has in this house." Clara held her gaze. "He will," Margaret said. "I have lived long enough to know that a certain kind of man does not understand value until he is very close to losing it. And I want you to know, before that happens, before whatever happens next, I want you to know that I know. I have known since the day you came to this house. You are the best thing in it." Clara's throat tightened. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to stand in the front hall of Carter Manor and cry. "Margaret?" she said when she could trust her voice. "Ma'am? You have never said anything like that to me before." "No," Margaret agreed. "I should have said it sooner." A pause. "Now go have your tea." Clara went and had her tea. She sat in the sitting room with her hands wrapped around the cup, and she thought about what it meant that the truest thing anyone had said to her in 5 years had come from the housekeeper, and not from the man who had promised at an altar to be her husband. And then she thought about something else. She thought about what she wanted, not what she was willing to accept, not what she could manage, not what was reasonable or practical, or what a woman in her position was expected to want, what she actually wanted. It was, she discovered, a surprisingly large list. Nathaniel noticed the change, the way a man notices weather, not by looking for it, but by feeling it shift around him, before he understood what was different. He came home on a Thursday evening to find the house full of noise, the pleasant, purposeful noise of people who had things to do, and discovered that Clara had arranged for 4 women from the neighboring farms to come and use the Carter Library for an afternoon reading group. They were gathered in the front parlor when he arrived, and there was laughter coming from behind the partially closed door. Real laughter, the unself-conscious kind that didn't know it was being heard. He stood in the hall with his hat in his hand and listened to it. He knocked before entering his own parlor, which he had never done before, and did not entirely understand why he did now. And when he opened the door, 4 women and Clara looked up at him. The women were polite and slightly startled. Clara looked at him with an expression that was pleasant and entirely untroubled by his entrance. "Nathaniel," she said, "you're home early. These are my friends, Mrs. Bell, Mrs. Coburn, Mrs. Aldridge, and Mrs. Portman from Richmond." "Ladies," he said. "We were just finishing," Clara said. "I'll have Margaret set supper for 7 o'clock if that works for you." He said it did. He went upstairs and changed out of his riding clothes, and he stood for a moment at the window of his dressing room and looked out over the front drive, and he could not have explained exactly what he was feeling, only that something in the house was different from what it had been for as long as he could clearly remember. The house used to be quiet. Quiet in the way that orderly things were quiet. Everything in its place. Everything managed. The silence of a well-run operation. But there was another kind of quiet he had grown so used to that he had stopped hearing it, the quiet of a person suppressing herself, making herself smaller, waiting. That quiet was gone, and he didn't know what to do with its absence. It was the following week that he first saw her in town. He had ridden into Clover Hill on a matter of business, a meeting with the county clerk about a deed adjustment, and when he came out of the clerk's office, he saw Clara on the opposite side of the main street. She was standing outside Reed's Books, talking to Samuel Reed, who had brought a crate of books to the door and was setting it on the wagon Clara had driven in. They were talking the way people talked when they were comfortable with each other, easily, with occasional laughter, without the particular formality that most people used around Clara when they remembered she was Nathaniel Carter's wife. Nathaniel stood on the opposite side of the street and watched. He had met Samuel Reed a handful of times over the years. He knew him as the bookseller. A decent man. A quiet man. Unremarkable was how Nathaniel would have described him if pressed, which he never had been, because Samuel Reed was not the kind of man who had ever given Nathaniel Carter any reason to think about him. He was thinking about him now. Samuel Reed said something, and Clara laughed full and real, not the polite social laugh Nathaniel had heard her produce at dinners for years, but something completely unguarded, and she picked up one of the books from the crate and turned it in her hands and said something back. And Reed nodded emphatically. And they were just two people who liked books and liked each other and were having an ordinary conversation about something that clearly mattered to both of them. Nathaniel stood very still. He did not feel what a guilty man feels. He was not yet at the point of guilt which requires first the acknowledgement of wrong, and he was not there yet. What he felt was stranger and less nameable. He felt like a man who had walked past the same window every day for 5 years, and one day looked through it and found something unexpected on the other side. He turned and walked back to his horse without crossing the street. He rode home without completing 2 of the 3 things he had come to town to do, and he could not have explained why, except that he needed, with a suddenness he did not fully understand, to be somewhere that was not that street. That evening he went looking for Clara. He found her in the study at the writing desk in the corner working through some document by candlelight. She looked up when he came in. "I saw you in town today," he said. "I had to collect the book Samuel ordered." You know Reed well. It was not quite a question. She treated it as one anyway. "Well enough," she said. "He's ordered books for the Tuesday sessions 3 times now. He keeps the account honest and he finds what I need." She looked at him calmly. "He's a good man." "I don't doubt it," Nathaniel said. A pause. He stood in the room, feeling the unfamiliar weight of having come in without a clear purpose, having said what he came to say, and finding that it hadn't resolved whatever had sent him in search of her in the first place. "The Tuesday sessions," he said. "How many children now?" 18, Clara said. "And 7 women." He said nothing. "Thomas Bell's boy James is reading Federalist papers," she said. "He's 12 years old, and he reads them for pleasure." She paused. "You have 3 Federalist volumes in this study you have never touched. He's working through the second one." Something moved through Nathaniel's expression that was gone before it fully arrived. "If he needs more paper for his notes," Nathaniel said after a moment, "tell him to send word." Clara looked at him. "I'll tell him," she said. He nodded, turned to leave. "Nathaniel." He turned back. She was looking at him with that even, untroubled gaze that had started somewhere in the last few weeks to feel like something other than patience. "The South Reservoir," she said. "Thomas Bell mentioned it. 3 farms downstream could use the water." He looked at her. "I'll look into it." She held his gaze. "I'll have it done by Friday," he said. She nodded, turned back to her papers. He left. He went down the hall to the front parlor and poured himself a glass of brandy and stood by the dark window and drank it slowly, and he could not have told anyone precisely what he was thinking, only that somewhere between the street in Clover Hill and the study just now, he had become aware of something he should probably have noticed a long time ago. His wife had a life, a full and real and meaningful life, and he had no place in it. He had spent 5 years not particularly wanting one, and now standing in the quiet of a house that was no longer as quiet as it used to be, he was not entirely sure what to do with the discovery that the absence of something he had never appreciated felt quite without warning, like loss. He finished the brandy. He poured another. He stood there a long time in the dark, listening to the house around him, the small sounds of it, the tick of the clock, the distant voice of Margaret instructing someone in the kitchen, and somewhere underneath all of it, the quiet of a woman in a study who was no longer waiting for him. And for the first time in 5 years of marriage, Nathaniel Carter felt something that had no name yet, but was working its way toward one. The South Reservoir opened on a Friday just as Nathaniel had said it would. Clara found out not from Nathaniel himself, but from Thomas Bell, who drove his wagon up to the Carter gates on Friday afternoon with his hat in his hand and asked to speak to Mrs. Carter directly. Margaret brought him to the back porch, where Clara was sorting the week's primers, and Thomas stood there, with his big weathered hands turning his hat brim, and said, "The water came through this morning, Mrs. Carter. All 3 farms. I wanted you to know." Clara set down the primer she was holding. "I'm glad," she said. "It's more than that." Thomas stopped turning his hat. He looked at her straight. My corn might make it now. Aldridge's field too. That's 2 families' winters, Mrs. Carter. I wanted to say it to your face. She stood up and extended her hand the way a man would direct and without ceremony. Thomas Bell looked at it for half a second, then shook it firmly. You tell James to come Tuesday, she said. I have the 3rd Federalist volume waiting. Thomas nodded and put his hat back on and drove away, and Clara stood on the back porch and let herself feel the satisfaction of it, clean and simple and entirely her own. Not a reflection of Nathaniel's name, not a product of Carter money, not this time. She had asked. He had acted. But the asking had been hers, which meant the water in those fields was in some small but real way something she had put there. She carried that feeling with her for exactly 2 days. Then the letter arrived. Chaparral. It came in the regular Thursday post, tucked between a land registry notice and a bill from the Richmond supplier. Margaret brought the stack to Clara as usual, and Clara sorted through it at the writing desk in the study, and she almost set the thin envelope aside unopened, because the handwriting on the front was unfamiliar. But something made her look at it again. It was addressed to Mr. Nathaniel Carter, which was ordinary enough. What was not ordinary was the second line beneath the name written in a smaller, neater hand, and Mrs. Carter warmly. She turned it over. The seal on the back was a simple pressed circle with no family insignia. A private seal, not a business one. She set it on the stack for Nathaniel. But for the rest of the morning she thought about that second line, and Mrs. Carter warmly. It was an odd addition. Most correspondence came addressed to Nathaniel alone as a matter of convention, and Clara received it and sorted it and occasionally opened it when it pertained to household business which was well understood between them. But this was personal, and someone had made a point of including her. She asked Margaret about it at noon, describing the handwriting, and Margaret's face did something precise and controlled. I don't know the hand, she said. But she had paused before saying it, and Margaret Ellis did not pause. Clara filed the information and said nothing more about it. Ciao. Nathaniel opened the letter that evening after supper. Clara was in the sitting room with her needlework. She had returned to it in the last few weeks, not as an occupation of waiting, but as something to do with her hands, while she thought. Which was different. And she heard him in the study, heard the particular quiet that followed the sound of paper opening, and then a longer quiet than usual. She did not go in. He came to her. He stood in the doorway of the sitting room, with the letter in his hand, and his expression arranged into something she could not immediately read. Not his business face, which was closed and certain, and not his social face, which was warm on command. Something between those two things, and underneath it, something that might have been discomfort. The Aldersham family is coming to Virginia, he said. Clara set down her needlework. I don't know the name. Robert Aldersham. His family is from Boston, old money. Nathaniel looked at the letter in his hand rather than at her. We met in Richmond 2 years ago. He has a daughter. The word daughter landed in the room with a weight Clara recognized before she understood why. She waited. His daughter he is looking to establish connections in Virginia. He's written asking if they might visit Carter Manor, as our guests. He paused. He's written to us both. I know, Clara said. I sorted the mail. Nathaniel looked up. I didn't open it, she said, but I saw the envelope. He looked at her steadily. I want you to understand that I have not encouraged this. Clara picked up her needlework again. Her hands were steady. When are they coming? He proposes the last week of August. That's 3 weeks. Yes. We can accommodate them. I'll speak to Margaret about the guest rooms. She made a small, neat stitch. How long will they stay? He doesn't say exactly. A week, perhaps. All right. Another stitch. Will Miss Hayes also be a guest that week? The silence that followed was the longest silence she had sat through in 5 years of marriage, and she had sat through a great many of them. Clara, Nathaniel said. I'm not accusing you of anything, she said without looking up. I'm asking a practical question. If we are having house guests, I need to know who they are and how many. Miss Hayes will not be a guest here, he said. Fine, she said. Then I'll arrange for 4 rooms, the Aldershams and rooms for their staff. Nathaniel stood in the doorway a moment longer, holding the letter with the expression of a man who had come in expecting one kind of conversation and found himself in a different one entirely. I am not, he started. I know, Clara said quietly. He left. She made 3 more stitches before she set the needlework down and pressed both hands flat against her knees and breathed in and out very slowly and deliberately, the way her mother had taught her to do when she was a child, prone to temper a thing she had controlled so thoroughly for so long that almost no one alive knew she had one. She breathed until the shaking in her hands stopped. Then she picked up the needlework and went back to it. The next Tuesday, she told no one about the Aldershams. She drove to the Bell Farm, and she ran her reading session, and she listened to Hattie sound out every word on a new and harder page, and watched James Jr. demolish 3 pages of Federalist argument with the focused intensity of someone who had finally found something worth being intense about. She helped 2 of the women work through a letter one of them had received from a son working in Philadelphia. A difficult letter, with long words and an official tone, and she sat with them until they understood every sentence. She drove back to Carter Manor in the late afternoon, and Samuel was on the road coming in the opposite direction in his own small cart, and he pulled up alongside her. Tuesday went well, he said. James Jr. is going to be a lawyer, she said, or a senator. I haven't decided which to prepare him for. Samuel laughed. At 12, his mind is already made up. I'm just supplying the vocabulary. She paused. The new readers arrived this morning. Thank you for the fast order. I told the Richmond supplier it was urgent. He looked at her for a moment. You look tired, Mrs. Carter. She looked at him. I'm fine. I didn't say you weren't. I said you looked tired. She held his gaze and discovered, as she sometimes did with Samuel, that there was no comfortable way to deflect a plain observation from a person who made them without agenda. We're having house guests at the end of August, she said. It requires arranging. The Aldersham family, Samuel said. She went very still. How do you know that? Robert Aldersham sent me a letter asking about book recommendations for the Virginia countryside. Samuel watched her face carefully. He mentioned he was visiting Carter Manor. He seemed enthusiastic about the connection. Clara looked straight ahead at the road. He wants to establish his daughter in Virginia. So I gathered. A pause. Are you all right, Clara? It was the first time he had used her given name without the title. She noticed it the way you notice a door opening in a wall you had thought was solid, not with alarm, but with an acute awareness of the space it revealed. She turned to look at him. Samuel, she said, do you know what the strangest part of all this is? Tell me. 2 months ago, that letter would have broken something in me. She said it simply, examining the truth of it as she said it. I would have sat in my room and held it together with both hands and told myself I was fine, and spent a week finding things to do so I didn't have to feel it. And now I just want to make sure the guest rooms are properly aired. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. His expression was careful and kind, and carried in it something she recognized as the particular attention of a person who sees you as you actually are and is not frightened by any part of it. That is either a sign of great strength, he said, or great tiredness. Maybe both, she said. He touched the brim of his hat. Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter. Good afternoon, Samuel. She drove on. The charity gathering happened the second week of August, 10 days before the Aldershams were due to arrive. It had been Martha Haverford's idea, originally a summer event to raise funds for a proper schoolhouse in Clover Hill, something more permanent than a borrowed room in the Bell Farm. She had come to Clara 3 weeks before with a plan and a budget and an expression that said clearly she considered Clara the only person in the county capable of actually executing it. Clara had said yes because she believed in the school and because having something important to build was she had discovered the best possible medicine for a life that was trying to make her feel small. She organized it with the same precise energy she had always brought to Carter Manor's social occasions, except that this time she was doing it for something she had chosen, rather than something she was obligated to maintain, and the difference in how it felt was so complete it was almost startling. She enlisted Mary Bell and the other women from the reading group. She coordinated with Samuel on a book donation drive. She wrote letters to every family in a 20-mile radius, and she wrote them herself by hand, because that was the kind of detail that people noticed and that she had learned mattered far more than elaborate arrangements. She did not tell Nathaniel the full scope of it until 4 days before, when he came in to find her at the writing desk surrounded by lists and correspondence, and the remnants of what had clearly been a sustained organizational effort over many weeks. He stood in the doorway and looked at it all. "This is the charity gathering," he said. "The schoolhouse fund," she said without looking up. "The gathering is Saturday." "I didn't know the scope of this. I didn't ask for help." She made a note in the margin of a list. "I didn't need any." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to attend." She looked up then. He was standing very straight with that contained formal quality he carried into situations where he wasn't sure of his footing, and there was something in his face that was different from the expression he used for business obligations or social performances. He looked, she thought, almost uncertain. On Nathaniel Carter, uncertainty looked like a coat worn for the first time, not quite fitting yet, but worn with intention. "It's open to everyone," she said. "You're welcome." Saturday came in hot and clear. The gathering was held on the green behind the Clover Hill Church, because the church grounds were the only space in town large enough for what it had become. Not the modest community event Martha had initially envisioned, but something considerably larger, drawing people from 4 counties who had heard about it through the spreading word of women who talked to other women and farmers who talked at markets and children who went home from Tuesday sessions and told their parents what Mrs. Carter was building. Clara arrived an hour early with Mary Bell and 2 of the other women, and she set things in order, the way she always set things in order, quietly, completely, without needing anyone to watch her do it. By mid-morning the green was full. There were farm families and merchant families and people Clara had never met who had driven in specifically because they had heard about the school project and wanted to be part of it. There were children everywhere, which was, Clara thought, exactly right. Children at the center of a gathering built around their futures. Samuel had set up a table with the book donations, and he was managing it with the focused efficiency of a person in their element, directing people toward titles and explaining the school's reading program to anyone who asked with a warmth and specificity that told Clara he had been thinking about it as seriously as she had. Martha Haverford worked the crowd with the practiced ease of a woman who had been hosting Virginia Society events for 30 years. The women from the reading group managed the food table and the donation collection, and did both with a pride that was new enough that you could see it clearly, the particular pride of people who were doing a real thing in public for the first time and discovering they were good at it. Clara moved through all of it, speaking to people, answering questions, making introductions, listening to concerns about the schoolhouse site and the teacher's salary and the curriculum, all things she had already thought through and had answers for. She did not look for Nathaniel. She heard him arrive, or rather, she heard the particular shift in the sound of the crowd that happened when Nathaniel Carter walked into a gathering, a slight increase in alertness, a reorientation of attention, the way people moved slightly toward significance without quite knowing they were doing it. She kept talking to Mrs. Aldridge about reading primers. She became aware of him moving through the crowd. She had always been aware of him in rooms, had always tracked his position without meaning to, the way you track a sound in the dark by instinct rather than intention. But today, the tracking felt different. It felt like something she was doing from a distance rather than toward. He moved through the crowd and people greeted him, and he was gracious and present, in the way he was always gracious in public, and she registered all of this peripherally without turning to face it. It was Thomas Bell who brought them into the same space. Thomas appeared at Clara's elbow while she was talking to a group of families about the proposed schoolhouse location, and he said, "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter is asking about the land question. whether the Hooper parcel on the east side of town would serve, or whether the church plot is better. She excused herself from the group and followed Thomas. Nathaniel was standing with three men she knew: James Haverford, the county surveyor named McCord, and old Pastor Gibbs, who owned the church parcel and had been quietly allowing it to be discussed without committing to anything. Nathaniel looked at her when she approached. "Thomas says you've been in conversation with Pastor Gibbs about the church plot," he said. "For 6 weeks," she said. Pastor Gibbs, who was 70 and had the expression of a man who had made peace with most things, said, "Mrs. Carter has made a very sound case for the church land, Mr. Carter. The plot's drainage is better, and it sits central enough that children from 4 directions can reach it without crossing the main road." "And the cost," Nathaniel said. "That's what we're discussing," Clara said. "The church would donate the land itself if the community funds the build. I have an estimate from a builder in Richmond, $1,200 for a proper 2-room structure, which gives us capacity for 40 children." McCord the surveyor whistled low. "We've raised $340 today," Clara said, "with the book sales and the donations already pledged. I have letters from 6 families in the county who've committed to quarterly contributions for 2 years. Nathaniel was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. "You've been planning this for months," he said. "Since May," she said. "Yes." He held her gaze. Something moved through his face, quick and complex there and gone. Then he turned to Pastor Gibbs. "If Mrs. Carter's builder estimate holds, I'll cover the remainder." The small group went very still. Clara went still. "The full remainder," Nathaniel said. "Whatever the community raises, I'll match what's needed to finish the build." Pastor Gibbs said, "Mr. Carter, It's a school," Nathaniel said. "In my county. For children I'm responsible to." He paused. "It should have been done years ago." He said it without looking at Clara, but she heard it. And she thought she understood what he was actually saying underneath those words, not just about the school. She didn't get a chance to speak to him alone until late in the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned and the donation table was being cleared and the last groups of families were making their way toward the road. She was standing at the edge of the green, making notes in the small book she carried when she felt him step up beside her. Not behind her. Beside. $340, he said. "In one morning." "362, she said, without looking up. "The final tally came in while you were talking to McCord." He was quiet. "You should have told me," he said, "about the scope of this. I could have helped." She looked up from the book. She looked at him directly the way she had been looking at him more often lately, without the softening, without the careful management of what she let him see. "I didn't think you'd be interested," she said. He looked like she had said something that cost him. Not an accusation, just a fact. And somehow the fact was worse. "Clara," he said. "You can speak to McCord next week about the build timeline," she said. "I'll have the plans from the Richmond builder by Thursday. If you want to be involved, I won't prevent that." "I want to be involved." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough to let the words settle and examine what was underneath them. "Then come Tuesday," she said. "Come to the Bell Farm and meet the children you're building the school for." He blinked. Whatever he had expected her to say, that wasn't it. "All right," he said. She nodded and went back to her notebook. He stood beside her another moment. She could feel him wanting to say something else. She had always been able to feel that in him, that particular held quality of words not yet spoken, but she did not prompt him, and he did not find them. He walked back toward the remaining guests. Samuel appeared at her elbow 30 seconds later with the quiet timing of a man who had been deliberately not standing too close. "He committed to the full remaining cost," Samuel said, not quite a question. "He did," Clara said. "That's generous." "It is." She closed her notebook. "It's also 6 months too late for me to know whether he means it because he believes in the school, or because he is beginning to understand what he is losing." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Does it matter? She looked at the green at the cleared tables, at the remnants of what $362 and 6 months of her energy and the labor of 20 women and the enthusiasm of 40 children had built in a single morning. Not to the children, she said. No, to the school it doesn't matter at all. She paused. But to me, she said, and stopped. Samuel didn't fill the silence. She appreciated that about him more than she could have easily said. To me, she continued quietly, I am still deciding. He came Tuesday. She didn't know he was going to. She had issued the invitation without expecting him to take it seriously, not because she thought him dishonest, but because she had a long history of Nathaniel Carter intending things that did not become actions. But when she drove the small cart through the Bell Farm gates that Tuesday morning, Nathaniel's horse was already tied at the fence. She sat in the cart for a moment. Then she climbed down and went inside. He was in the Bell front room. He was actually sitting, not standing at the edge of things, in the way powerful men sat in rooms they didn't belong to yet, on the bench along the wall, with James Jr. beside him. James Jr. had the Third Federalist volume open across his knee, and he was talking at a pace that suggested he had entirely forgotten to be impressed by who he was talking to, which was the best possible sign. But Madison's argument here doesn't account for what happens when the states disagree with each other, not just with the federal government, because he assumes a kind of, Nathaniel said, he assumes a rational actor. James Jr. stabbed a finger at the page. Exactly, and men aren't always rational actors. No, Nathaniel agreed. They are very rarely rational actors. Clara stood in the doorway. Neither of them noticed her immediately. James Jr. turned a page. Do you think it worked, the Constitution? Nathaniel looked at the page. I think it was the best available argument made by men who understood that a perfect answer wasn't possible, so they built something that could be argued with, something that could change. He paused. That might be the wisest thing they did. James Jr. considered this with the serious expression of a 12-year-old who was not going to agree with something just because an adult said it. Then he nodded slowly. I think so too, he said. I think the arguing is the point. Clara stepped into the room. James Jr. looked up. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter says he's never read the third volume all the way through. I believe that, she said. I told him he should borrow it when I'm done. James Jr. looked at Nathaniel with the straightforward confidence of a child who had not yet learned that social class was supposed to make him hesitant. You can have it next Tuesday, if I finish the last 2 papers. I'll hold you to that, Nathaniel said. He looked up at Clara, and she saw something in his face she had been watching for, without knowing she was watching. Not guilt, which comes from the outside in, from being caught from someone else's judgment, landing on you. Something that comes from the inside out. Something that looked like a man beginning to understand at a cellular level what kind of person his wife was. Not realizing it because she had told him. Not realizing it because someone had accused him. Realizing it because he had come to a small farm on a Tuesday morning and sat on a bench and talked to a 12-year-old boy about the Constitution, and found there a world his wife had built from nothing, brick by patient brick, while he had been looking somewhere else. Hattie launched herself at Clara from across the room. Mrs. Carter, I read the whole new primer, the whole one, even the hard page at the end. Clara caught her and held her and said, Show me. And Hattie ran to get the book. Nathaniel watched. He watched Clara sit down with Hattie and open the book and listen with her full, complete, unhurried attention, while a 6-year-old sounded out every word on a hard page. And he watched Clara's face, the expression on it. The realness of it, the way she lit from the inside when Hattie got a difficult word right and looked up for the reaction she knew would be there. He had been married to this woman for 5 years. He had never seen that expression before. Not because she had been hiding it, because he had never been in a room where she had reason to show it. He stood up and walked quietly to the door and stepped outside. He stood by his horse and he looked at the dry summer fields and the distant line of the Blue Ridge, and he felt the full, clean, terrible weight of what he had spent 5 years failing to understand. His wife was extraordinary, not in the way he would have described it before, not composed or efficient or well-regarded. Those were the words of a man describing a service, a function. She was extraordinary the way a person was extraordinary when they went on caring about the right things long after the world had given them every reason to stop. He had given her every reason to stop. She hadn't, and now she was inside a farmhouse on a Tuesday morning with a 6-year-old and a stack of borrowed primers building something that was going to outlast every piece of land he owned. And she wasn't doing it for him, and she wasn't doing it for his name, and she wasn't doing it so that he would finally see her. She had stopped doing it for him entirely. And that was the thing, the specific, precise thing that broke something open in Nathaniel Carter that 5 years of a failing marriage had not managed to touch. He stood at the fence until Thomas Bell came around the side of the barn and said quietly without ceremony, "Water came through to Aldridge's field this week too." "Good," Nathaniel said. Thomas leaned on the fence post and looked out at the same horizon. "You got a fine wife, Mr. Carter." Nathaniel said nothing. "I know it ain't my place to say it." Thomas turned his hat brim in his hands, the same way he always did when he was going to say a thing straight. "But I'm going to say it anyway, because I'm 60 years old, and I figure I've earned that right. You got a fine wife, finest woman I've known outside of my Mary. And I think you know that. I think maybe you've been knowing it for a while now." Nathaniel looked at him. Thomas put his hat back on. "Just thought it needed saying out loud." He walked back around the side of the barn. Nathaniel stood at the fence a while longer. When he went back inside, Clara was at the front of the room with all the children gathered around her, and she was reading aloud, not from a primer, from a proper book. A story, something with adventure in it, and every single child in that room was absolutely still and absolutely present. Leaning forward, the way people leaned towards something they didn't want to miss even one word of. He stood in the back. He did not announce himself. He just listened. And for the first time in 5 years, Nathaniel Carter stayed in a room without agenda, without purpose, without any practical reason at all, only because the person at the front of it was someone he did not want to stop watching. The Aldershams arrived on a Wednesday. Clara had the guest rooms ready by Tuesday evening. Fresh linens, cut flowers from the garden. She tended herself a small basket of preserves and local honey on each bedside table. The kind of detail that cost nothing except attention and communicated everything about how a household was run. Margaret had inspected every room with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that hospitality was a form of argument, and what Clara was arguing quietly and without a word to anyone was that Carter Manor was managed by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Robert Aldersham was 55, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of a Boston man who had made his money honestly and spent 30 years knowing it. He shook Nathaniel's hand at the door and then turned to Clara and bowed with a warmth that was entirely genuine. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I have heard considerable things about you." Clara looked at him steadily. "From whom, Mr. Aldersham?" He smiled. "Martha Haverford wrote to my wife last month about a schoolhouse project. She mentioned the woman behind it rather extensively." He paused. "She used the word formidable." "Martha is generous," Clara said. "Martha Haverford," Robert Aldersham said, "is many things, but I have never heard anyone accuse her of generosity in her assessments." Clara almost smiled. "Come inside," she said. "Margaret will see to your bags." His daughter was 22 years old. Her name was Eleanor, and she was quiet in the way that intelligent young women were sometimes quiet, not out of timidity, but out of the habit of watching first and speaking second, which Clara recognized because it was a habit she had cultivated herself once upon a time, before she had learned that waiting for the right moment to speak sometimes meant never speaking at all. Eleanor shook Clara's hand with a directness that was more Boston than Virginia and said, "Your house is beautiful, Mrs. Carter." "Thank you," Clara said. "It's had good care." She watched Eleanor glance at Nathaniel. It was a brief glance, politely curious, the kind a 22-year-old woman gave a man she had been told was important and was now assessing for herself. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and then Eleanor's attention moved on to Margaret, who was directing the luggage, and the glance was so thoroughly unremarkable that Clara felt something in her chest unknot that she had not entirely realized was knotted. Eleanor Aldersham had not come here for Nathaniel Carter. She had come because her father was doing business, and she had come the way daughters of that era came, on such trips obligingly with her own thoughts about it, kept neatly private. Clara took her upstairs herself to show her the room, and on the landing Eleanor said, "My father told me about the school project. I'd like to hear more about it if you don't mind. In Boston, I've been involved with a women's reading society. It's smaller than what you're doing, but the—" She paused, searching for the word. "The resistance is similar." Clara looked at her. "What kind of resistance?" Eleanor's mouth curved. "The kind that says women who read too much develop opinions. And do they?" Clara said. "Every single one of them," Eleanor said. "It's the whole point." Clara opened the door to the guest room and said, "Rest from your journey. Come down at 6 and tell me everything about the Boston Society." Dinner. The first evening was the kind of dinner Clara was good at, the kind where the food was exactly right, and the conversation was steered carefully enough to be interesting without becoming uncomfortable, and everyone left the table feeling slightly better than when they sat down. Robert Aldersham talked land and markets with Nathaniel, with the easy fluency of men who spoke the same language, and Clara contributed where she had something real to add and held back where she didn't. And across the table, Eleanor watched the room with those quiet, assessing eyes, and occasionally said something precise and sharp that made her father laugh and Nathaniel pay attention. After dinner, when the men moved to the study and Margaret brought tea to the parlor, Eleanor sat across from Clara and said without preamble, "How long have you been running the reading sessions?" 11 months, Clara said. "And the school, when will it be built?" "The builder breaks ground in October. If the weather holds, it'll be ready by spring." Eleanor wrapped both hands around her teacup. "In Boston, we've been trying to get a women's school approved for 4 years. 4 years of committees and letters and reasonable arguments and nothing." She looked at Clara. "How did you do it?" Clara thought about it. "I stopped asking permission," she said. "I just started." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's much harder than it sounds." "Yes," Clara agreed. "It is." They sat together in the comfortable way of women who had found each other unexpectedly, and were both glad of it, and the fire in the grate burned low, and outside the August night pressed warm against the windows, and Clara felt something she had not felt in this house for a very long time. She felt at home in it. Nathaniel watched. He had been watching since Tuesday. Since the Bell Farm, since James Jr. and the Constitution, and Hattie and the Primer, since Thomas Bell at the fence, saying, "You got a fine wife, Mr. Carter," with the simple authority of a man who had observed the truth long enough to be sure of it. He watched Clara manage the Aldersham visit with the same effortless competence she brought to everything, making Eleanor feel welcome, giving Robert exactly the level of engagement he needed, without being obsequious about it, running the household so smoothly that its smoothness was invisible, which was the highest possible form of the skill. He watched her with Eleanor Aldersham at breakfast. On the second morning, the two of them talking about the Boston Reading Society, with the focused animation of people who had found a shared subject and were not going to waste it. And he noticed that Clara was different in that conversation. Looser, quicker, more herself than he usually saw her, and he realized with a clarity that was almost physical that he was watching a version of his wife he had never created the conditions for. He had never given her a table where she could talk about what she cared about. Not once in 5 years. He went to his study after breakfast and sat at his desk and did not open a single piece of correspondence for 20 minutes. He just sat. And he did what he had been slowly, painfully, reluctantly doing for the past 3 weeks. He thought honestly about himself. Not the version of himself that he presented to the county or to business associates or to the Mirror in the morning, when he was performing the small internal negotiations of a man who needed to believe he was doing well enough. The actual version. The one that had ridden away from the house on a Tuesday morning for 3 years without once asking where his wife was going. The one that had stood at a party with another woman and let a room full of people watch his wife stand alone. The one that had said composure when he was asked what drew him to Clara Whitmore, as though she were a quality he was acquiring rather than a person he was choosing. He had chosen her the way a man chose a well-made coat. Useful, reliable, did what it was supposed to do. He had never once asked what she needed. He pressed both hands flat on the desk and looked at them. Strong hands, capable hands, hands that had managed 3,000 acres and 200 workers and a business correspondence that ran to 30 letters a month. Hands that had not reached for his wife in longer than he could clearly remember. He stood up. He went looking for Margaret. He found her in the linen room, which was where she went when she was doing the work she most preferred, precise physical requiring no conversation. "Margaret," he said. She turned. She looked at him with those 50 years of seeing everything eyes, and waited. "I need you to tell me something honestly," he said. "And I need you to understand that I'm asking because I want the truth, not because I want to be told I'm doing well." Margaret set down the sheet she was folding. "That would be a first," she said. It was the bluntest thing she had said to him in his life. He absorbed it. "Is she happy here?" he said. "Clara, is she happy in this house?" Margaret looked at him for a long measuring moment. "She is happy now," she said carefully. "She has built things that make her happy. The sessions, the school, the women she's brought into this house." A pause. "But that happiness has nothing to do with you, Mr. Carter. She built it around you, in the spaces you weren't using." The words landed exactly as hard as they deserved to. "Did she ever—" He stopped, started again. "Was there a time when she—" "When she loved you," Margaret said, because she had apparently decided this was the day for plain speaking, and she was going to see it through. "Yes, Mr. Carter. There was quite a long time when she loved you very much. When she stayed up learning what you liked, and what you needed, and what would make you comfortable, because she thought that was how you built a marriage, by making yourself into what the other person needed. And now, Margaret said she has figured out that she was wrong about that. Not about love, about what builds it." She picked up the sheet again. "The question is, what you intend to do about it." He stood in the linen room doorway for another moment. "Thank you, Margaret," he said. "Don't thank me," she said, smoothing the sheet with both hands. "Do something." He found Clara in the garden that afternoon, alone for the first time in 3 days. The Aldershams had gone into town with Margaret as their guide, Eleanor wanting to see the bookshop specifically, which Clara had arranged with a quiet satisfaction. The garden was her own project, separate from the household work. Something she had planted in the first year of their marriage and tended every summer since. He had walked past it 1,000 times without stopping. He stopped now. She was kneeling in the dirt with her gloves on, working at something near the base of the rose bushes, and she didn't hear him until he said her name. She looked up. Her face did what it did now when she saw him. Not the careful, composed expression she had used to wear, the one that gave nothing away, because she was protecting what was underneath. This was simpler, clearer. She was just herself, looking at him, waiting to see what he wanted. He came and crouched down to her level, which he had never done, and the awkwardness of it, the physical fact of a man of his height and bearing folding himself down into a garden, seemed to say something he hadn't found words for yet. "Can I talk to you?" he said. "You're talking to me," she said. He looked at the rosebush, then at his hands, then at her. "I have been a poor husband," he said. She was quiet, not in the ways that are obvious. He was choosing his words with the same care he used on important correspondence, slowly making sure each one was load-bearing. "I provided for you. I was not cruel. I didn't—" He stopped. "But provision isn't the same as presence. And I was not present." Clara sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. Not unkindly, not defensively, just directly the way she was direct about everything now. "Because it's true and I should have said it before now." "All right," she said. "It's true." He hadn't expected her to agree so readily. He had expected he wasn't sure what he'd expected. Some softening. Some rush to reassure him that it wasn't as bad as all that, which was the kind of thing she would have done 2 months ago. She didn't do that. "Is that all?" she said. He looked at her. "No." He breathed in. "I am sorry, Clara. Not as a formality. Not because the Aldershams are here and it seemed like the right time. I am sorry because I have sat with it for 3 weeks, and I know exactly what I did, and I know exactly how long I did it for, and I have no excuse for it that would satisfy either of us." Clara looked at him for a long time. The garden was very quiet around them. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once and then stopped. "You watched another woman at the Haverford gathering," she said, "on our anniversary." "Yes. And the room watched me watch you." "I know." His voice was low. "I knew at the time. I told myself I don't know what I told myself. Something that let me keep doing it. I'm ashamed of that." "Were you in love with her?" Clara asked, flat and direct. "With Caroline Hayes?" He met her eyes. "No. She was easy to be around. She didn't know me well enough to require anything from me. And He stopped, looked at his hands again. "I had made this house a place where I didn't want to be required of, and she was what I went to instead of fixing that." Clara absorbed this. "That is the most honest thing you have ever said to me," she said. "I know," he said. "That's also something I'm ashamed of." She pulled off her gardening gloves, one finger at a time, and set them on her knee. She looked at the roses she had been tending. She had planted them in the first spring of their marriage with the kind of hope that plants things in ground. It hasn't broken yet, when the future still seems like somewhere you could put down roots. "I loved you," she said quietly. "For quite a long time. I loved you the way a person loves someone they have decided is worth the work, and I did the work, Nathaniel. I did all of it. I learned everything about you. I made your house and your life run without friction. I waited for you to notice me." She paused. "And one morning I woke up and realized I had spent so much energy trying to be worth noticing that I had forgotten to notice myself." She looked at him. "That's what changed. Not you, me." He held her gaze and let it land. "All of it." "I know," he said. "I watched it happen. I didn't understand what I was watching until it was already done." "The Bell Farm," she said. "Tuesday. Before that," he said, "in the study, when you told me Samuel Reed was already ordering the books and you thanked me for the offer without needing it. I felt it then. I just didn't have words for it yet." Clara was quiet. A long quiet. The kind that wasn't empty but full of 5 years, and a list written in a journal, and a candle blown out, and rose bushes planted in hope. "I can't go back to being the woman who waited," she said finally. "I can't do that again. Not for anyone. I'm not asking you to." He said it firmly. "I'm not asking you to be different than what you've become. I'm asking—" He stopped, set his jaw, tried again. "I'm asking if there is any version of this where I could start learning how to be the husband you should have had from the beginning." She looked at him, really looked at him, not at the landowner, not at the Carter name, not at the man who had moved through her house like she was furniture. At the person crouching in the garden dirt in his good clothes, saying the words she had waited 5 years to hear. 3 weeks too late, and also possibly just in time. "That depends," she said. "On what? On whether you understand that I'm not waiting anymore, that I will keep going to the Bell Farm on Tuesdays. I will keep building the school. I will keep having women in this house and talking about things that matter to me, and I will not arrange my life around your moods, or your schedule, or your approval. Not ever again." "Good," he said. She blinked. "I mean that," he said. "I don't want the woman who waited. I've been watching the woman who didn't wait for 3 weeks, and she is—" He stopped himself, steadied. I have made the worst mistake a man can make, which is failing to see something right in front of him. I would like the chance to see it now, if you'll allow it." Clara stood up. She brushed the dirt from her skirts and looked at him as he straightened to his full height, and between them, the air held everything that 5 years had accumulated. The loneliness, and the effort, and the missed mornings, and the anniversaries, and the candle, and the journal, and the line she had written and underlined. "I am worth more than being a woman who waits." "Come to Tuesday," she said. "I already came to Tuesday. Come to the next one." She held his gaze. "And the one after that. Come because you want to know the children's names, not because it looks well for a Carter to be associated with a school." "All right." "And Nathaniel." She paused. "If you ever make me invisible in a room again, if I ever stand somewhere public and feel what I felt at the Haverford gathering—" "You won't," he said. "If I do," she continued steadily, "I will walk out of this house and I will not come back. Not for the name, not for the land, not for anything." The words were not heeded. They were not issued as a threat. They were stated the way Clara stated everything that mattered, precisely because she meant every single one of them. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "I understand," he said. "Do you—" "Yes, Clara." Something in his face shifted, something that had been held for a long time, releasing its grip by degrees. "I believe I finally do." She nodded once, picked up her gloves, turned back to the roses. "Supper at 7, she said. "Eleanor wants to talk more about the school. I'd like you to be there for the conversation." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll be there," he said. She heard him walk back toward the house. She knelt down again in the dirt, both hands pressing into the warm earth, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, not the relief of it, which was there, but complicated, and not the vindication, which was there too, but didn't feel the way she'd imagined it would. What she felt was something quieter and more serious than either of those things. She felt like a woman who had just made a decision with her whole self clearly and without apology, and discovered that the decision felt exactly like what it was, not an ending, and not quite yet a beginning, but the sharp and necessary moment between the two. She pressed her hands into the earth, and the roses, patient as they had always been, held their ground around her. Keg. That evening at supper, Eleanor Aldersham was talking about the Boston Society, about the women who had come to it, their backgrounds, what they had found there, that they couldn't find anywhere else, and Clara was listening and asking questions, and the conversation was alive in the way that conversations were alive when the people in them cared about the subject. And Nathaniel was there, not performing being there, not managing the room, just sitting at his own table, listening to his wife talk about something she had built, asking Eleanor a question about the Boston model. That was an actual question, not a redirect, not a polite insertion, but genuine curiosity. And Clara looked at him from her end of the table, and he looked back. Robert Aldersham, who had spent 30 years reading rooms, looked between them both with the mild expression of a man noting something that was none of his business and would not be commented upon. Margaret, refilling the water glasses at the sideboard, let herself breathe out very quietly, and Clara held Nathaniel's gaze for a moment longer than she needed to, and what passed between them was not the language of people who had figured things out. It was the language of people who had, for the first time, decided to try. The Aldershams left on a Saturday morning, and the house went quiet in the particular way it went quiet after guests, not empty, but recalibrated, settling back into its own rhythms. Robert Aldersham shook Nathaniel's hand at the door, and then turned to Clara, and held both her hands in his and said, "Mrs. Carter, my wife will write to you. I'm warning you now so you're not surprised by the volume of correspondence. She has opinions about school curricula, and she has been waiting for someone worth sharing them with." Clara laughed, a real one, unguarded. "Tell her I'll write back just as much." Eleanor hugged her. Actual arms, actual warmth. The kind of embrace that said, "I found something here I wasn't expecting, and I'm not pretending otherwise." She whispered, "Come to Boston sometime. I want to show you what we're building." "I will," Clara said, and meant it. She stood on the porch and watched the carriage roll down the drive and disappear past the tree line, and the morning was still and gold, and the first edge of September was in the air, not quite yet, not cold, but the heat had softened overnight into something gentler, the way Virginia summers sometimes let go in small concessions before they fully released their grip. Nathaniel stood beside her, not behind her, not at a managed distance. Beside. They watched the empty drive together. "She'll write to you," he said. "I know." Clara turned to go inside. "I'll have a desk set up in the side room. For the correspondence. I've been using the study, but there's a lot of it now." "Use the study," he said. "I'll move what I need to the morning room. The light's better there anyway." She stopped. She turned and looked at him. He said it so plainly. No ceremony, no performance of generosity, just a practical adjustment offered the way you offered a thing when you had decided the other person needed it more. "Nathaniel," she said. "It's a desk," he said. "It's not complicated." But she knew, and he knew she knew, that it was not only about a desk. It was the study that had been his exclusively for 5 years of their marriage. The room she had always knocked before entering the space in the house that communicated most clearly the architecture of their arrangement. And he was moving out of it. "All right," she said. She went inside. He stayed on the porch a moment longer looking at the same empty drive, and then he followed. September arrived and brought with it the groundbreaking for the school. Clara had organized a small ceremony at the Hooper parcel on the east side of Clover Hill. Not elaborate because the money was for the building and not for the occasion, but proper enough to mark it. Thomas Bell and his family came. The women from the reading group came. 18 children came dressed in their best, with the slightly dazed expression of young people who had been told they were witnessing something important and were trying to feel the full weight of it. Pastor Gibbs said a few words. The builder from Richmond, a compact and serious man named Hale, showed everyone where the 2 rooms would sit and how the windows were oriented for light. And James Jr. asked 3 questions about the structural choices that made Hale look at him with surprised respect and answer all 3 in full. Clara stood at the edge of the small crowd with a shovel in her hand and felt the particular sensation of watching something you built in your mind become a thing in the physical world. Nathaniel was beside her. He had come without being asked which she had noticed and not commented on. He had also brought his own shovel, which he had quietly collected from the Carter stables that morning, and when the moment came for the first breaking of ground, he did not step forward to do it himself. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "It's yours," he said. She drove the shovel into the Virginia dirt herself first, and clean, and the small crowd around her made the sound that small crowds made at moments like that, not cheering exactly, but a collective exhale of satisfaction, of recognition, of something mattering in public, the way it had been mattering in private for a long time. Hattie Bell clapped with her whole body. James Jr. pressed his lips together and looked at the ground as though he needed a moment alone with the significance of it, which Clara found more moving than any noise could have been. Mary Bell caught Clara's eye from across the gathering and held it for a moment, and then nodded once deeply fully, the way women nodded at each other when words were not the right instrument. Nathaniel drove his shovel in beside hers. Not before. Not instead. Beside. Thomas Bell, standing just behind them, said quietly to no one in particular, "There we go." October moved in steadily, and with it came the week that nearly unmade everything they had started building. It began with a letter from Caroline Hayes. Clara found it in the Morning Post on a Tuesday, addressed to Nathaniel, as all his correspondence was, but with the same private seal she recognized from the Aldersham envelope. She set it on his stack without opening it, and went about her morning and told herself the tightness in her chest was not what she thought it was. Nathaniel opened it after breakfast. He read it at the writing desk in the morning room. His space now the study having become Clara's without further discussion between them, a transition so natural it had happened before either of them named it. Clara was in the study when he came in. He held the letter. She looked at him. "She's leaving Virginia," he said. "Her father has arranged a match in Maryland. She's writing to—" He paused. "To say goodbye. And to apologize. Clara held very still. "To you," she said. "To us." He set the letter on the edge of her desk. "She says she understands now what she was participating in, and she is sorry for it. She says you conducted yourself with more dignity than she deserved." He looked at Clara steadily. "She is not wrong about that." Clara looked at the letter without picking it up. There was a version of herself, the one who had stood at the Haverford gathering, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a chest full of careful dignity, who would have needed this moment. Who would have held it like a settlement, like a proof of something. She didn't pick up the letter. "I hope she's happy in Maryland," she said. Nathaniel watched her face. "That's all?" "That's all." She looked up at him. "It's done, Nathaniel. She wasn't the problem. She was a symptom of the problem. The problem is what we're working on." He was quiet for a moment. "You are a more generous person than I am," he said. "I know," she said, and turned back to her correspondence. He laughed. Actual and unexpected, the same low, real sound she had heard from him at the Haverford gathering, but aimed at her this time. At himself. At the two of them. She looked up. He was still smiling when he left the room. She sat for a moment after he was gone, looking at the space where he had stood, and she let herself feel what that laugh had cost her, not badly, not painfully, but fully. She let herself feel it, the way you let yourself feel the first warm day after a long winter, carefully, with the knowledge that one day doesn't make a season, but also with the honest acknowledgement that the warmth is real. The second Tuesday of October was the one that showed her clearly what was changing. She drove to the Bell farm as she always did, and she arrived to find that Nathaniel had already been there for 20 minutes. He had ridden ahead. She hadn't known he was coming, and when she walked in, he was at the table with James Jr. and two of the younger children, with a large hand-drawn map spread between them, that he had apparently made himself showing the county roads and the farm properties, and the creek that ran between them. James Jr. was pointing at the map and saying something about water access, and Nathaniel was listening with his arms folded and his head bent and the full, genuine attention of a man engaged with a problem he found real. Hattie saw Clara first. "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter made a map." "I can see that," Clara said. Nathaniel looked up. Something moved across his face. A brief self-consciousness quickly managed. "James had questions about the reservoir system. I thought it would be easier to show him." James Jr. looked up with the expression of someone determined not to waste a resource. "He said I can come see the actual reservoir. In November, when the build slows down." Clara looked at Nathaniel. "If that's acceptable," Nathaniel said. "To her. Not to Thomas, not to James Jr. To her, because he understood now whose program this was. "It's more than acceptable," she said. She settled in with the younger children and the reading session, and the morning ran the way it always ran, with noise and effort and occasional chaos, and Hattie mispronouncing something spectacular, and Ruth asking a question that stopped everyone cold, because it was too good to move past quickly. At one point, Clara looked up from helping a 7-year-old with a difficult page, and saw Nathaniel crouched beside Thomas Bell near the window. Both of them looking at something in the Bell farm accounts book. Thomas had brought it out without being asked, which meant he had decided to trust Nathaniel with something real, and the two men were talking in low, serious voices. And Thomas's expression was the careful but open expression of a man giving considered trust rather than obligatory deference. She looked back at the 7-year-old and found the line. But her chest felt different than it had all summer. Not healed. She was honest enough to know that healing was not a Tuesday morning, not a map, not a laugh in a study. Healing was long and uneven, and required more time than she had yet given it. But different. Unmistakably, genuinely different. On the ride home, Nathaniel rode alongside the cart, instead of ahead of it, or behind, which was new. The road between the Bell farm and Carter Manor ran through a stretch of old trees that made the light come down in pieces, and the horses moved easy in the cooler air, and for a while neither of them spoke, which was also new, a silence that wasn't avoidance, but just two people moving through the same afternoon. James Jr. should read law, Nathaniel said. I know, Clara said. I've been thinking about how to make that possible. He looked at her. Have you talked to McCord, the surveyor? His son studied in Richmond. He might know the path. I hadn't thought of McCord, she said. I'll ask him. He paused. If you want me to. Yes, she said. Please. Another stretch of quiet. Clara. His voice had a different quality than it did when he was being practical. She looked at him. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer honestly the way you've been answering me lately without managing it. She waited. Are you all right? He said. Not the house, not the school, you. Are you all right? The question was so simple and so long in coming that she felt it land in a place that had been waiting for it without knowing it was waiting. She took a moment. I'm better than I was, she said. I'm not all the way to all right yet, but I'm better. He nodded. He didn't try to fix it, or redirect it, or offer something that would require her to reassure him in return. He just received it. Thank you for telling me, he said. She looked at the road ahead. You should ask more often, she said. It's not a hard question. It felt hard, he said. Before. I think because I wasn't sure I wanted the honest answer. She glanced at him. He was looking at the road too, and his profile in the October light was the profile of a man who was doing the uncomfortable work of knowing himself accurately, which she had come to understand was not a thing that came naturally to him, and was therefore, when he did it, more meaningful than it might have been in someone for whom it was easy. It's a hard answer to give, she said, if no one has ever asked. He looked at her. I'm asking now, he said. I'm going to keep asking. She held his gaze for a moment. Then I'm going to keep answering, she said. November brought the school walls up. Hale's crew worked fast in the dry weather, and by the third week, the structure was standing, and the children from Tuesday sessions made a field trip to see it all 18 of them, plus the 7 women, plus Thomas Bell and Mary, and several other families who had been following the progress, the way you follow something you have contributed to and now partly own. Clara stood inside the empty frame of the first room and listened to the sound of 18 children discovering the dimensions of a space that was being built specifically for them. And the sound was extraordinary, full and physical and completely unself-conscious, the sound of people who did not yet know enough to moderate their joy. Nathaniel stood beside her. It's bigger than I expected, he said. 40 children, she said. It needs to be. He looked around the empty room. At the window frames oriented for the morning light the way Hale had explained. At the place where the second doorway would connect to the back room. At the ceiling height that would carry voices without distorting them, which Clara had specified herself after thinking carefully about what a room full of reading children actually needed. You thought of everything, he said. I've been thinking about it since May, she said. You have a lot of time to think when no one is asking your opinion on anything. She said it plainly. Not bitterly, she had moved past the bitterness somewhere in September, left it behind the way you left behind a coat that had kept you warm through a hard season, but didn't fit anymore. Just plainly. He heard it the way he had been learning to hear her fully, without flinching away from the weight of it. I'm asking now, he said, echoing what he'd said on the road last month, a kind of promise he was making into a pattern. She looked at him in the bare frame of the school she had built. I know, she said. James Jr. appeared in the doorway with the focused expression of someone who had a logistical question that couldn't wait. Mrs. Carter, where's the library going to be? Reed's sending 30 volumes in the spring, and I want to know where the shelves will be. East wall, Clara said. Under the window. James Jr. nodded, examined the east wall, examined the window, and then looked at Nathaniel. Mr. Carter, when I come see the reservoir in 2 weeks, can I bring my father? Nathaniel looked at him. Bring whoever you want. James Jr. nodded, with the decisive air of a person settling a matter, and disappeared back outside. Nathaniel watched the empty doorway. "He's going to be a senator," he said. "I've been saying lawyer," Clara said. "Both," Nathaniel said. "One then the other." She almost smiled. "Don't tell him that. He already has opinions." "Good," Nathaniel said. "Virginia needs more men with opinions and the education to back them up." She looked at him fully then. At this man who had said composure in a parlor 6 years ago, who had moved through her house like she was furniture, who had stood at a party with his hand on another woman's arm, while his wife stood alone, and the whole room watched, and she looked at him standing in the bones of a school she had built, talking about a 12-year-old farmer's son becoming a senator, and she felt the full complicated truth of it. He was not a different man. He was the same man working very hard imperfectly and consistently to become a better version of himself. And there was something in that, the effort of it, the unglamorous daily labor of it, that she found she could respect in a way she had not been able to respect the performance of the man he had been before. Respect was not love, but it was something you could build on. And she was, as it happened, very good at building. December arrived cold and clear. The school was closed up tight against winter, waiting for spring to finish it. The Tuesday sessions moved to the Carter parlor for the cold months, which had required one conversation between Clara and Nathaniel, and no disagreement whatsoever, which was still new enough to be noticed. On the last Tuesday before Christmas, after the children had gone and the women had gone, and the Carter parlor was being set to rights by Margaret, and her assistant Clara was in the study finishing a letter to Eleanor Aldersham about the spring term curriculum, when Nathaniel knocked. She had noticed he knocked now, every time, without being asked, without being reminded. He knocked on her study door the way a person knocked when they understood the room belonged to someone else. "Come in," she said. He came in with 2 cups of coffee, which he set on the edge of the desk, one for her, one held in his own hand, and pulled the chair from the corner to the side of the desk and sat down. Not across from her. Beside. "I have something to say," he said. She set down her pen. He held his cup with both hands, looking at it, then at her. "I know I've been saying things," he said, "since August. And I know that saying things is not the same as doing them, and I know you know that better than anyone." He paused. "I also know that you are not the same woman who was waiting for me to see her, and that I cannot offer you the things I should have offered 5 years ago as though they are gifts now. They're not gifts. They're what was owed." Clara held very still. "So I'm not going to tell you I love you tonight," he said, "because that word, after 5 years of what I put in the space where it should have been, it would take more than 4 months of trying to make it mean what it should mean." She exhaled slowly. "What I'm going to tell you," he said, "is that I see you. I see what you've built, and what it cost you to build it, and who you are when you're in a room full of children who can read because of you. I see the woman you were when I said composure, and failed to understand that what I was actually describing was strength. I see her." He looked at her directly. "And I intend to keep seeing her, every Tuesday and every day after it, for as long as you'll allow me the chance to make the word mean what it should." The study was very quiet, the winter dark pressed against the windows. Clara looked at her coffee cup, then at the letter to Eleanor half finished, then at the man sitting beside her desk who had moved out of this room so she could have it and was now sitting in it beside her, doing the hardest thing she suspected he had ever done, which was speaking the truth about himself without armor. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "You're going to be at the Bell Farm on Tuesday." "Yes." "And the one after?" "Yes." "And when James Jr. comes to see the reservoir?" "I already told Thomas to bring the whole family." She looked at him. He looked back at her. Between them, the coffee sat warm, and the fire in the grate held its steady light, and the house around them was quiet, in a way it had not been quiet in years. Not the quiet of suppression and absence, not the silence of a woman making herself small, but the quiet of a place that had been tended back to life by patient hands. "Then keep seeing me," she said. She said it simply. Without conditions and without ceremony, the way she had learned to say the things that mattered plainly because they deserved to be plain. Not a surrender, not a forgiveness issued wholesale in a single moment. Something more honest than either of those things. An open door. He nodded. Once. Fully. He picked up his coffee. She picked up her pen. They sat together in the study that used to be only his, and was now only hers, and was becoming quietly without any announcement at all theirs, and the letter to Eleanor waited, and the school waited, and the children waited, and 12 Tuesdays of Virginia winter waited, and none of it was finished. Because the real things never were. But all of it was moving steadily, and with purpose, in the direction of something true. Spring came the way it always came to Virginia, sudden and completely, as though it had been waiting just behind the last frost, and had simply been looking for the right moment to walk through. The school opened on the first Monday of April. 41 children. 41 because word had spread further than Clara had planned for, and she had not turned anyone away, and Hale had said the structure could hold 45 if they were friendly about it. And she had said that children who wanted to learn were always friendly about it. She stood at the door of the school and watched them come in pairs and clusters, and the occasional single child who had walked a long way alone and arrived with the particular dignity of someone who had decided this mattered enough to do without company. She greeted each one. She knew most of their names. The ones she didn't know by the end of the morning she had written in the small notebook she kept for things that mattered. Nathaniel stood beside her at the door for the first hour. He shook hands with Thomas Bell and with 6 other fathers who had come to see their children walk in, and he did it the way a man shook hands when he meant something by it. Looking each one in the face, using their names, asking a specific question that showed he had been paying attention to who they were rather than what they represented. Thomas Bell waited until the others had gone inside and then said to Nathaniel quietly, "You know what's different about you, Mr. Carter." Nathaniel looked at him. "You used to shake a man's hand and look past his shoulder at whatever was next," Thomas said. "Now you look at him." He nodded once. "Makes a difference." He went inside. Nathaniel stood at the door a moment. Clara came and stood beside him. They could hear the school, the sound of 41 children and a teacher finding the shape of a first morning together, the noise and settling, and occasional sharp note of a question asked into a new kind of room. "It's loud," Nathaniel said. "Yes," Clara said. "It should be louder," he said. She looked at him. "Next year," he said. "More children. More rooms if we need them. The Whitfield cousins have land on the north side of the county. I've been thinking about a second building." She turned to face him fully. "When did you start thinking about that?" "November," he said. "When James Jr. asked about the reservoir, and I realized there were children on that side of the county who couldn't make the walk to Clover Hill." She stared at him. "You've been thinking about this since November, and you're telling me now." "I wanted to see if the first one worked," he said. "I don't announce things I'm not sure I can do. Not anymore." She held his gaze, and there it was, the thing she had been watching for without letting herself watch for it, because hope was a thing she had learned to handle carefully. Having once held it so constantly, it had worn grooves in her hands. Not the grand gesture, not the speech, the evidence. The specific, unglamorous, irrefutable evidence of a person who had changed not in a moment, but in the long, quiet accumulation of Tuesdays. "November," she said again softer. "I kept notes," he said, "in case you wanted to see them." She laughed. It came out of her before she could manage it full, and surprised and real. The same unguarded laugh she had given Robert Aldersham on the porch. But aimed this time at Nathaniel, at his notes, at the beautiful, improbable, ordinary fact of this man, keeping notes in November about a second school she hadn't known he was thinking about. He looked at her laugh the way a man looked at something he had waited a long time to see. "Show me the notes," she said. "Tonight," he said, "after supper." She nodded. She looked back at the school door. Inside, the first lesson of the first morning had begun. She could hear a voice reading aloud, the teacher's voice, clear and measured, and underneath it, the particular silence of children listening, which was a different silence than any other kind. She felt Nathaniel's hand find hers, not dramatically, not with ceremony. his hand moving to hers the way water moved toward low ground, slowly following the shape of things, finding the place where it fit. She let him hold it. It was not a resolution. It was not an arrival. It was not the end of all the distance they had accumulated, or the full account settled on 5 years of loneliness. It was a Tuesday. An ordinary and extraordinary Tuesday in April in Virginia, with 41 children learning to read in a school that hadn't existed a year ago, and a woman who had stopped waiting for someone to see her standing in the morning light being seen, and a man who had finally learned that the greatest thing he possessed was not his land or his name or the 3,000 acres that ran from the Carter gates to the ridge. It was the woman standing next to him, and she had been there all along. She held his hand. And Clara Whitmore Carter, who had planted roses in uncertain ground, who had driven herself in a small cart to a farm on a Tuesday morning, and decided she was worth more than waiting, who had built a school from $362, and the labor of women who had been told they were not worth educating, stood in the April warmth, with her hand in her husband's hand, and felt for the first time in 6 years of marriage that the life she was living was exactly, completely, and without compromise her own. And that was worth every single thing it had cost to get there.